Eunice, is everyone in?
Yes, sir.
Okay, we're going to begin. First, I'm Mark Morial. I serve as President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Urban League. And happy Sunday to all. And certainly we want to say how much we appreciate each of you for joining. I'm joined today by 7 colleagues. Those 7 colleagues are Chief to as the nation's historic or legacy civil rights organizations. I'm pleased to moderate today's press conference. And let me simply begin with the fact that we note that today is the 59th anniversary of the historic 1963 March on Washington, the most important mass demonstration of the 20th century. That demonstration, that mobilization and engagement was organized and led by leaders who led our organizations back in 1963. So we come together today standing on that legacy, on those shoulders, to note this very important date. And today we issue a call to action because, like 1963, when the march occurred, it was a few months after the events in Birmingham, where Bull Connor sicked fire hoses and police dogs on demonstrating children and their families in downtown Birmingham. It was 6 weeks after Medgar Evers, esteemed leader of the Mississippi NAACP, was shot in front of his home in Jackson, Mississippi. And literally 2.5 weeks before the bombing of King Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, we today say that democracy is at risk, and therefore there is a state of emergency when it comes to democracy and voting rights today. As we speak today, we issue a call to action and will outline steps that we believe every American can take to protect, to defend, to promote democracy, and to ensure that this naked assault on democracy and voting rights, which has been underway for more than a decade, and which is accelerated in the most recent years and months, is not successful. So today, on the 59th anniversary of the March on Washington, we issue a call to action. This is a serious and important moment in American history. So we began today with our colleague, Reverend Al Sharpton, the leader and founder of the National Action Network. Reverend Sharpton.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to my colleagues. 59 years ago, the March on Washington was coordinated, as stated, by legacy organizations. And as we gather 59 years later, we have not had as direct a structural threat to the rights and liberties of our community in more acute ways than we have had in the last 59 years. The threat to voting, the threat to people's choice in terms of women's choice, right to choose, the threat to our dealing with the issues of healthcare and education, all are now under a direct threat because we, for the first time since the Civil War, have an open threat to how we handle democracy itself. The undermining of the vote, the raising suspicion of large portions of this population that we will decide the outcomes of elections by mob rule and by partisan state legislatures, rather than the right of the citizens to vote, a right we had to fight for, has never happened to the level that it has grown since the Civil War. That is why it is imperative that we fight together as a collective body of civil rights organizations and leaders to fight and back up this threat. This is not a partisan fight, but when you're in a state of emergency, you need emergency people to come and deal with it, and that is what we're doing. For the last 20 years, National Action Network has worked with Martin Luther King III and others, and with the support of all of these organizations, to commemorate the march by going to Lincoln Memorial. We went with Mrs. King in 2000 and 4 times since then. The last big one was 2020 with the Get Your Knee Off Our Neck on this date, where over 200,000 people came out in a pandemic in March. Last year, all of us led 50,000. We didn't go to Lincoln Memorial in March to the Capitol to deal with voting. We decided this year, rather than spend resources gathering in Washington, to be in critical states around this country, organizing on the ground, to get past voting impediments, to get people past whatever their state legislatures were doing to rob us of our right to vote so that we can vote to save our democracy. Let us not forget the Civil War was the Union against the Confederates, that they would not let states' rights run this country. We are organizing and we are calling for action today to save the Union when it comes to our fight in criminal justice reform, which includes police reform, which includes how we choose judges, how we deal with the question of bail reform. When it comes to our voting rights, we also include the right of people to choose, as well as LGBTQ rights. All of these rights are at risk if we do not get past the voting impediment. And that is why this year we've decided to be on the ground and call for the redemption of this country and the preserving of Martin Luther King's dream. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Reverend Sharpton. And now, proud to introduce Melanie Campbell, President of the National Coalition for Black Civic Participation and convener of the Black Women's Roundtable. Melanie.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to all my colleagues here today and for those listening. Today, it's a moment to also celebrate our history. This historic moment of the 59th anniversary of the March on Washington in 1963. We also know that history is a great teacher. So it is also my honor and responsibility to join in solidarity with my civil rights colleagues to remind our nation of how the March on Washington of 1963 brought about transformational change for Black Americans that ushered in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and in the Fair Housing Act of 1968. We join in solidarity to celebrate this anniversary by lifting up the civil rights leaders and organizers that led the '63 March: A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, James Farmer, and many others, Whitney Young, and many others. Today, we also celebrate lifting up the role of Black women who helped to lead and organize the '63 March, including Diane Nash, Dr. Dorothy Irene Height. In '63, the March on Washington for Jobs and Justice was also a collective response by civil rights organizations to fight back against racism, hatred, and repression that had long plagued and terrorized Black people for decades. So here we are today, once again, finding our rights and freedoms are under attack and our democracy is under threat. Thanks to the rolling back of the rights by the US Supreme Court, including voting rights and reproductive rights, the passage of repressive voter suppression laws targeting Black and brown people being enacted in over 19 states over the past several years, the historic rise in racism and white nationalism across this country, an attack on our democracy and the rule of law by white nationalists and insurrectionists. Therefore, we are here to not only lift up the past, but to honor the future by recommitting ourselves in a unified and collective call to action to continue the fight for our rights, freedoms, justice, and safety, and to save our democracy from peril for future generations to live out their dreams. In closing, we know that the 22 midterm elections, which are less than 80 days away, will determine if our nation will remain a democracy or fall into the hands of racists, white nationalists, and insurrectionists and become an authoritarian state. These elections are the most important elections of our lifetime. Specifically, there are 34 US Senate races, 435 House representative races, 36 gubernatorial races, and 88 of the 99 state legislative chambers will hold elections in 2022 that will determine the balance of political power on a federal, state, and local level, for a generation or longer. The 2000 midterm elections are the most important elections of our lifetime. People say that all the time, but 60 years later, here we are again fighting for our rights. So for us, this is a unifying call to action. As my colleagues have already stated, it is a state of emergency. So we joined earlier this summer in launching our Unity Voting and Power Building campaign. We joined together in a summer of organizing and activism, and we're going to carry that through the fall elections to mobilize all of our communities to also protect that right to vote and make sure that the next generation has more opportunity than those of us here and those of us whose shoulders we stand on. So this is a historic moment. It is a state of emergency. There are no do-overs. We can and we must learn from our history by voting in record numbers and keep up the fight for our rights and freedoms like our lives depend on it, because they do. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Mel. Now I'm proud to introduce the President and Chief Executive Officer of the NAACP, Derek Johnson. Derek?
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Melody and Al. 59 years ago, many of our organizations and people from African American and other communities convened on Washington, D.C. They convened to discuss not a dream, but a promise that had been denied. That promise that was embedded in a social contract we call the Constitution. And in that Constitution is the promise of democracy. I was mentored by many individuals who left from that march disappointed because they knew they was going back to the state of Mississippi where their promise would not be realized and there was more work to do. And as we stand on this press conference today, and it's ironic to say stand while we're virtual, we also realize that that promise for many have not been realized, but also that that promise is under threat. Saving our democracy is the key work of all of our organizations. In fact, it's the key work of all Americans who love the Constitution and love this country. And one of the things that we have said over and over that could not coexist, white supremacy and democracy. They cannot coexist. And the direct threat to our democracy is the use of race through this concept of white supremacy to diminish individuals' rights and their voices. And so we are here today to call on all Americans, but particularly African Americans, to stand up as we lead into this midterm elections. We are nonpartisan, but we are political because it's through politics that policy is made so that that Constitution, that social contract can live up to its promise. Now, Dr. King, even in his speech, it wasn't about a dream. It was about the Constitution living up to its promise. It continues to be about the Constitution living up to its promise. And that's why federal appointments to the bench is so important. That's why turning out in November becomes so important. In fact, in a recent poll by NBC and a series of focus groups at the NAACP Commission, one of the top 3 issues continues to be the threat to our democracy. And so the fight that we must carry on, if we truly believe in the spirit of the March on Washington, if we truly believe in the many speeches, particularly the speech given by Dr. King, we must fight to protect our democracy. At some point, we must stand up around what's right, what's equitable, and what's moral. And if we do that together across communities, but led by the civil rights organization that's convened here today, we will realize that promise. But until then, the dream would never be realized, because the dream is all about making sure our democracy is safe, making sure our democracy intact, and making sure that promise we call the Constitution live up to the words that's embedded on the paper. Thank you for the opportunity, and I hope the press would pivot the message and talk about the threat of our democracy and not create false fights among organizations, and stay focused on the fight that's at hand, and that is protecting our democracy. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Derek. Now we go to the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, Damon Hewitt. Damon?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mark and colleagues. My name is Damon Hewitt, President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. The Lawyers Committee was founded in that pivotal summer of 1963, less than 2 weeks after Medgar Evers was assassinated, and just 2 months before the historic March on Washington, the anniversary of which we commemorate today. Thanks to the efforts of Black voters around the country, the multiracial, multi-generational coalition that revitalized the movement for racial justice following the murder of George Floyd, we now have leadership and a president who has secured significant victories for Black people and people of color. But we know it's not enough. The last 2 years have shown in stark clarity that our democracy, as our colleagues have said, is under sustained and unrelenting attack. Draconian voting laws at the state level that restrict access to the ballot and dilute the voting strength of Black and brown voters in so many states. Courts that continue to chip away at laws designed to protect ballot access, and also ignoring decades of precedent on issues ranging from reproductive rights to voting rights. The January 6th Capitol insurrection, driven by white supremacist rhetoric and white supremacist organizations, intentional misinformation, and the big lie of voter fraud allegedly in the Black community. This was no aberration. The same co-conspirators and their apologists remain a threat to our democracy. They remain a threat to continue trying to overturn legitimate election results. Now, we know in the face of these ongoing threats, here's what we have to do. We must defend the rule of law. We must hold accountable those who defy it. And we have to protect the right to vote that our elders died for. That means ensuring that every eligible person who wants to cast a ballot can do so. That means ensuring that the votes that are cast are actually counted. And of course, preventing legitimate results from being overturned by rogue actors, elected officials, or insurrectionists and rioters. We also have to pass legislation that expands ballot access and stops voter suppression in its tracks before it happens. Legislation like the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. We know that this is the floor, not the ceiling of what is necessary to make the promise of our democracy real for Black people and for everyone in this country. Democracy is in fact a promise, but in the Black experience, it's a promise that too often feels empty, hollow, or simply unkept. I'm proud to stand with other civil rights organizations and other civil rights leaders and millions of people around the country who care about democracy, who care about racial justice. We are the defenders and the keepers of this promise together. Our eyes remain on the prize, regardless of the political cycle or the election cycles, and we who believe in freedom will not rest until we get there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Damon. Now we go to the President and Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Janae Nelson. Janae?
Thank you, Mark, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I am Janae Nelson, President and Director Counsel of the Legal Defense Fund. LDF was founded in 1940 by Thurgood Marshall, who later became the first Black Supreme Court Justice, along with a band of visionary lawyers who advanced this country to become the modern democracy that it couldn't even see for itself. We find ourselves at yet another inflection point in our history where our democracy is in flux, being pulled in opposing directions of progress and polarization. We at LDF, along with my colleagues here today, and a majority of Americans, firmly choose progress and the full realization of the promise of our multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. On August 28, 1963, 250,000 people rallied in Washington, D.C., under the moral leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King to demand an end to segregation and to assert their right to voting rights, economic justice, and equitable access to quality education. 59 years later, we are assessing the nation's progress on these vital issues, and two things are clear. One, the vote remains one of the most powerful tools for advancing economic and racial justice. And two, our democracy, as my colleagues have said, is in a state of emergency because too many have abandoned the unfinished work of the civil rights martyrs that helped make this country a respectable nation governed by the rule of law and guided by constitutional principles of justice and equality. There can be no doubt that because of the vote and as a result of unrelenting organizing and advocating for our rights, Black communities in America are better situated than they were in 1963 in critical ways. And progress to support Black communities and to strengthen the entire country is still being made. The recent passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and the cancellation of a portion of federal student debt both make clear that our vote can elect leaders who use their power to advance economic and racial justice. But that work is not close to complete. Indeed, we applaud the recent actions of Congress and the White House, but we also urge both in the strongest terms not to make the mistake of believing the job is done, because it is not. With regard to student debt, for example, it is true that the administration's recent debt cancellation will aid millions of Black Americans, but only 25% of that debt relief will go to Black borrowers, while 62% will benefit white borrowers. Along the same lines, while there are many provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act that will help combat environmental racism and racial injustice, it's also the case that the bill only passed after lawmakers removed dozens of provisions that were desperately needed to help new parents, working families, economically strapped seniors, and countless other members of the Black community and other communities of color. These recent accomplishments, therefore, must be first steps, initial investments. It's not a victory lap in the fight for racial and economic justice. And those efforts must remain ongoing so long as our economy is riven by structural inequity and racism. Despite record nationwide employment, the unemployment rate for Black workers is 6%, which is double that of white workers. Black households have only 12.7% of the wealth of white households. And Black graduates owe an average of $25,000 more in student loan debt than their white counterparts. Black farmers who have suffered known discrimination by the federal government, resulting in land loss and crippling debt, have still not been made whole. And in 2022, the racial home ownership gap is at 30%, which is worse than it was in 1960. So I'll close by saying that at a time when none of us can take our right to vote for granted, when the dual threats of voter suppression and election sabotage loom large, it's imperative that every individual who is dedicated to furthering the gains we've made commit to participating in the midterm elections. That means we vote, we get prepared to vote by going to voting.naacp.org, NAACPLDF.org. That means we staff our elections as poll workers by signing up at the polls at powerthepolls.org. And we call the Senate at 202-224-3121, and we demand that voting rights legislation that my colleague Damon talked about. It is the threat of white nationalism that undergirds voter suppression, the racial wealth gap, the war on truth and history that is the greatest threat to our national security, and it can only be beaten back at the ballot box this November. That's how we honor the people who marched for jobs and freedom in service of our democracy 59 years ago. That's how we ensure a future for our country that places everyone who believes in justice, equality, and humanity at the center. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janae. Now we go to our newest colleague, the President and Chief Executive of the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights, certainly not new to the struggle, Maya Wiley.
Thank you so much, Mark. And thank you all. I just want to express my incredible gratitude to every leader you have heard from. They are all friends, they are all allies, they are all partners. Because the Leadership Conference, just to give a little bit of background on us, was founded both by A. Philip Randolph, who, as we know, organized and helped to organize the March on Washington in 1963, and Roy Wilkins from the NAACP, Critical Leadership at a Critical Time, as well as Arnie Aronson, who was an important Jewish leader, because the movement itself recognized the importance of having policy impact, and that impact had to come from a collective, from a coalition. And you're talking to almost everyone on this Zoom is a member of the Leadership Conference, and those who aren't are partners. But this is the point and the call that you've heard. And I just want to start with a quote from A. Philip Randolph because of his importance in this day that we're both commemorating and recommitting ourselves to, which he said, "Winning the war for the Negro is winning the war for democracy." Now, you've already heard from my colleagues that this is a time in which we are fighting to save what we so desire in this country, which is our democracy, our ability to solve our problems together. And for Black people in the United States of America, we have always seen ourselves as an important part of the solution, and that our outcomes that benefit our communities are outcomes that benefit the country. That has always been true, and we've been looking for a country that recognizes that back, and we've been working together and fighting for it. But if we start with what we're seeing from the January 6th committee, and I am going to start there because I think it has become proof positive of what's at risk that we have been seeing and experiencing in the Black community and in the civil rights community writ large, across race, across gender, is that the attack started before Donald Trump. And for the Black community in particular, and for the Latino community in particular, it started with the big lie that we have heard that has been used to try to overturn a peaceful and democratic and lawful election. And for most of that, it's about vilifying our communities as if we are not part of the fabric of this country, but in a context where we already saw that attack coming at states after 2008, and with real vigor in states beginning in 2010, passing laws making it harder for us to vote. And then we've seen a Supreme Court stacked to essentially say, we will make it easier for states to undermine voting rights, make it harder for folks to vote, and therefore undermine our democracy. But we also saw the foot soldiers, right? And those foot soldiers were white supremacists and extremists, foot soldiers on January 6th. And the way in which we are watching voter intimidation, poll worker intimidation, intimidation of elected public officials, neutral, elected to make sure we have fair elections, is essentially to drive that lie. And in places like Arizona, have vigilante groups called out in some instances by elected officials to quote unquote guard drop boxes. Or in Fulton County, Georgia, where we're hearing that we are seeing on social media the disinformation about voter fraud trying to undermine voting in Fulton County. We know also from January 6th how important Fulton County is and who it represents. But this is the point, is we have a plan of action. Every single organization you have heard from is an active leader, champion, fighter on the ground. One of the things that A. Philip Randolph said on this day in 1963 is that this is the first wave, and that we go into every nook and cranny of this country to do exactly what he said we had to do as Black people, which is fight for democracy, because that's also about fighting for our communities. And this is what the Leadership Conference is doing. We are making sure that when there is misinformation and disinformation on social media in Fulton County, we're monitoring it and we're making sure that social media platforms are getting that information. We want to make sure we're getting that from you. Civilrights.org is where to find us. But just as my sister Janae Nelson said, power to the polls. We're actively working with Power to the Polls to get more poll workers signed up. We saw with Black women during January 6th, their lives threatened only because they were doing a public service. We are working to make sure more people show up for fair elections and making sure we have people who are protecting the vote and not trying to protect a politician. And the other thing I want to lift up is we're actually working on voter education and voter registration with organizations on the ground in rural Georgia, in Florida and the Panhandle, and we're going to keep doing that. We're all doing it. It is a collective, it's a coalition, and we all have our roles. But this is exactly the point of today. It's to say that it's not just where we've been and what we won. It's because we won it that it's under attack. It's because we are the majority that it's under attack. And it is because we work together that we're going to push it back. And what I finally want to say to every person running, asking for the privilege to serve the public as an elected official, if you seek to serve those of us who make up the majority of this country, we will have a strengthened democracy. If you serve to try to prevent us from protecting our bodies, from making sure we have judges, we've got literally, last point, literally we've got the next attack on our voting rights coming to the Supreme Court. And if you just take North Carolina and gerrymandering, there is a case that may say that even state courts can't protect the constitutional rights of their residents. And that is another form of states' rights that we're pushing back on. But that's what's at stake. And those that stand with us will gain. And those that don't, we will continue the fight to make sure that we only have folks who are pushing policies. We don't tell people who to vote for, but we do talk about the policies that protect our rights, our bodies, our choices, our families, and our ability to make sure we're all working together and not promulgating violence when we should have peaceful elections. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Maya. Next, we have someone who participated in the 1963 March on Washington. Hear me out. Participated in the 1963 March on Washington. Our colleague, Dr. Thelma Daly, who heads the National Council of Negro Women. We're proud she's with us today. Dr. Daly.
Thank you, Mark, very much. Thank you very much. Let me begin by saying I thank you for organizing us and for doing this. And I want to say first that for all of you, you know that the National Council of Negro Women was founded by a very strong Black woman, Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune. And you know what happened on July 13th when her statue was unveiled in the nation's capital. Many firsts in reference to that. But also the National Council of Negro Women had someone who was on the stage that day in 1963 by the name of Dorothy Irene Height, who served as president of the National Council of Negro Women for about 45 to 50 years. And yes, I was there that day, 59 years younger than what I am now. And I want to say that I can tell you about the spirit of that day. It almost reminds me of the words of Langston Hughes when he said, "My soul has grown deep like the rivers." And maybe for all of us who were there, that our souls really grew deep in terms of the meaning of that day and the diversity of the people and the aspect of all of the people coming together as a collective body. And what so much was resonating in terms of what it meant. And I think that whole aspect of the meaning of that day, I know people quote Dr. Martin Luther King in terms of his speech, but the meaning of that day and what it felt to people to be there that day, I have to tell you, when I went, I had fear what was going to happen. I'd never been in a march before. but the spirit of all of the people coming together to get together for goal. I think maybe that has propelled me to be a strong, strong advocate, to carry forth the meaning of this great day, to carry forth the meaning of this historic day. And when I look at Reverend Al Sharpton, who says, you know, we must commemorate this day. And I underscore what you're saying, because if you had been there, you would never lessen the feeling of the day. And so I underscore everything that you've said today. I almost like to say that what I'm saying is to really put a thread through it, to bind us all together with a thread that will never weaken. Because for that day, and the meaning of that day was for collective action, for a purpose, to save our democracy, to save the right to vote, and to safeguard the vote, and to diminish racism in this country. And I also want to say to fight for women, because the women did not really have a voice, but they found later to have a voice. And I hope the National Council of Negro Women will lend a strong, strong voice to this collective body, And so my words coming after all of the powerful speakers is just to say that there is a thread, the meaning of 1963, and that march should be a thread binding us together so that we can fight for all of the things that have been reiterated today. And those are my words, just that this thread should never be diminished, just like our democracy should never crumble, just like our voting rights and the right to vote and the power to vote should never be diminished. And we should be that thread binding it with the power, the collective power. I don't know if we realize the collective power we have on this group. I can only talk about the National Council of Negro Women, where we have 32 organizations, because we were founded as an organization of organizations, and all those are chapters we have right there that we call sections. But when I look at the power of all of the leaders on here, if we come together, as Mrs. Bethune said, I can touch it with one finger and you will not feel it. I can touch it with two and you will not feel it. I can even touch it with four and you will feel it. But if I put my fists together with the power there, and I would say symbolically on here today, there is power. And with the power and the meaning of the March in 1963, we must go forth as a collective body.
Thank you very much, Dr. Daly. Before we go to questions, permit me to offer a few thoughts. We today are unified, and as we are unified, we represent millions of Americans. Black Americans, yes, but beyond Black Americans. They are people for whom racial justice, the protection of democracy and civil rights are a core principle and value. We stand on the shoulders of those that gathered, yes, organized by the late, great A. Philip Randolph, who included, among others, my illustrious predecessor, the late Whitney Young, who joined with Dr. Haidt and Dr. King and Roy Wilkins and John Lewis and many, many others, religious leaders from all denominations, celebrities, citizens from the streets to the suites of America, to make a powerful statement in favor of American democracy. Our gathering today is predicated on a timeline of activities that have occurred that have been a direct threat to American democracy. 2013, the Supreme Court in its Shelby decision, undermining and gutting a key victory of the civil rights movement, the Voting Rights Act. 2015 and 16, a pernicious conspiratorial attempt by the Russian Federation to interfere in the American election by suppressing the African American vote. 2018, the assault on Charlottesville in protection of Confederate monuments, which were testaments to those forces that the 63 March was designed to counteract. Throughout the long thread accelerating after the election in 2008 of voter suppression laws in the hundreds in state legislatures all across America. And in 2020, the big lie posited and promoted by elected officials who were sworn to the Constitution that somehow after you lost an election fair and square, you yell sour grapes. You yell as a despot in third world countries yell, and that is that there's been fraud when there was no fraud, and we had a fair and free election in 2020. And then on January 6th, we saw the use of violence. Let me underscore this. The attack on democracy now involves the use of violence and the threat of violence against elected officials and public officials who are seeking to simply do their job. Threats against Secretary of States, threats against elections officials. We come today because the fact pattern that I've outlined demonstrates, as Reverend Sharpton said, that this attack on American democracy is unprecedented in modern times. And we commit our resolve, our energy, our organizing ability, our moral power, and everything we can to protect, defend, and promote American democracy, and to mobilize the largest coalition of people of goodwill to protect and defend American democracy. We will not rest on this anniversary. So each of us will this fall have an effort, and together these campaigns are going to touch millions of people to educate, to advise, to register, to turn out the vote, to protect the vote, to fight back against efforts to intimidate or coerce voters. And we are sending the strongest possible message. We're asking every American, elected officials, grassroots activists, men and women who are faith leaders, young activists, people from the streets to the suites, people from 18 and beyond, to join in this effort to defend, protect, and promote democracy. This moment in American history demands it and requires it. And it is on this day, the 59th anniversary of the historic March on Washington, that we accelerate this call to action in this period of crisis during this great state of emergency. So at this time, we thank you for your patience and for listening to us, and we will entertain questions. They'll be moderated by Teresa Kandori. Tess?
Hi, anyone who has a question can post it in the Q&A. You'll find the link at the bottom of your screen. We'll give people a minute or two to post their questions if they have any. Okay, last call for questions. And we will be sharing a recording of this briefing with everyone who registered. And you can respond to any of the emails on the media advisory if you have any questions that we were not able to answer here. At the moment, we have no questions in the Q&A.
Okay, well, look, happy Sunday to all.
Hold up, we have some now. Hold up. We have an anonymous attendee who asks, how can we take the manpower of these organizations and affect America economically?
Maya or Janae or Rev, anyone want to take that question?
I think the way that we can affect economically is by using our vote to make sure that we put people in office that will deal with the array of economic challenges that face our community. Everything from having fairness in employment. Let's not forget that there are 2 cases of affirmative action going before the Supreme Court this session that can also overlap from what is being dealt with in the academic community with Harvard. If there is a ruling that goes left, it could affect contracts and employment. I think that we have the HR 40 talking about reparations. All kinds of economic thrusts are dependent on our preserving the vote.
I'll chime in too, and I absolutely agree with the Reverend. A reminder that A. Philip Randolph was a union leader. Alan Ruther from United Auto Workers was also both a supporter of the Leadership Conference, of the Civil Rights Movement, and was very much a part of the 1963 March. I say that because the Civil Rights Coalition includes labor, and we know that so many of us need collective bargaining. We have been actively pushing for the PRO Act in Congress to protect the ability to collectively bargain. So that's just another example to Reverend Sharpton's point about the importance of letting our voices be heard, because that is actually one of the ways we do it. And one thing that may seem a little less direct, but is critically important, and I wanted to be clear about this, congratulations to the Biden administration for getting 79 federal judges confirmed. But there's a total of 133 waiting, and we expect 120 vacancies over the next 2 years total. But what that means is every time we have an economic issues go to the courts, go to the federal courts in particular to make decisions, whether it's about monopoly power or all kinds of other issues, including our rights to collective bargaining. It is imperative that we make sure and push for our judges that support civil rights, support a fair economy, to be appointed to the bench, and to get that moving and continuing to move very quickly. It's one of the successes. We need to keep pushing for that.
Let me add one other thing. I was going to add 2 things that are very specific. Number one, we have endeavored now for the better part of a decade to pass a federal increase in the minimum wage to get it up to a living wage. Our inability to get that done is predicated on the fact that we need more legislators who understand and who are committed to the basic principle that there should be decency and fairness when one works 40 hours a week so that they earn the type of wage that allows them to live and pay their bills. Number 2, the child tax credit, which lifted millions of children and millions of Black children out of poverty, was a temporary measure that was thwarted by a small handful of members of the United States Senate's Democratic caucus. So those are 2 instances where voting and electing people who are sensitive and understanding of economic disparities and the need to ameliorate poverty through public policy and legislation can indeed make a difference. There are many other things, but I wanted to make sure that we shared with the person who asked the questions specifics.
Let me say this,
Hi,
Mark,
Mark.
as well. I think
Um,
it's so important that we talk about what our elected leaders can do, that we emphasize the power of the vote, and that we also make sure that we hold private industry accountable. There is an important role for private industry to play in terms of matters of economic justice and matters of equality and discrimination. We've seen so many reports about disparate appraisals of homes in Black communities. We know that algorithmic bias affects credit reporting and scoring that provides access to loans and access to the ability to purchase homes and pass down intergenerational wealth. There are so many ways in which the corporations that operate in this country, that benefit from tax breaks, that benefit from government subsidies and incentives, perpetuate racial discrimination. And that is something that the Legal Defense Fund has been focused on. And I know that many of our organizations have trained their eyes on not just holding our elected officials to account, which is critical, but also holding private industry to account as well.
Thank you.
Mark, just want to just add a little bit. One of the things that we learned through the impact of COVID-19 that is really still with us, right, is that things around worker rights and workplace policies also impact the ability to deal with building wealth in this country. Over the last 2 years, the Congress, the House, and the Senate, many great bills that would deal with racial disparities were passed in the House, but failed in the Senate. And so when we go to the polls in this election cycle, we have the opportunity to pay attention to who voted for what. Voters out there who may be listening, to really pay attention to who voted for economic justice policies, who voted for the PRO Act, who voted for paid family and medical leave, who voted even for the issues around voting rights and reproductive rights. There are a lot of great bills that were passed. So this election will determine whether or not those bills come up again to be passed. It can have systemic impact when it comes to economic justice, equity, and opportunity in our community.
Thank you, Melanie. Tess, do we have other questions?
Barrington Salmon asks, are there other ways or methods to blunt or erase the voter suppression that state legislatures have been imposing outside of congressional legislation?
Maybe the litigators may want to update on the actions you all are taking. Janae Damon.
Sure. Thank you, Mark, and thanks for the question. So a number of our organizations, including the Lawyers Committee, are litigating and challenging these voter suppression bills throughout the country. I'll note a couple of states in particular, one, Georgia, where we have litigation still pending in federal court, and also in Texas, where we have sued the state of Texas in its own state courts. Our basic theory of the case is that Texas is at war with its own people and at war with itself, violating its own laws just to try to grab power for a certain political party. And so we do believe we can prevail in these cases. It is a tough climb, and the litigation is not as speedy enough to address in full what's happening in the midterm elections this year. The other thing that we can do is not fully see the state legislative processes themselves. I know other organizations have been very active at the state legislative level, making sure that community witnesses are telling their stories even before these bills are passed, and also documenting the aftermath. Another thing that we're doing throughout this campaign, this election season, in fact, every day, is through the 866 Our Vote election protection hotline. 866 Our Vote is the nation's largest and biggest and oldest nonpartisan voter protection campaign and effort and voter hotline. Everyone on this call has been a part of this effort to some extent over the last 20 years. And we intend to make sure that we deploy volunteer attorneys to every voter who needs an answer to a question, to every voter who needs assistance, whether it be on the spot before they go to the polls, or whether it be when they're at the polls as well, to make sure that we can take quick action and document as much as possible. Because sometimes what we have to do is just to help people navigate these arcane laws and rules before they vote, so they make a plan to vote. And then if we can't get them to be able to cast their ballot, then we have to document it and use litigation and political process to address it after the fact.
Thank you,
I'll
Damon.
just add that, yeah, I'll add that one of the areas of progress and victory, frankly, has been at the state level, where we most recently worked to help pass the New York State Voting Rights Act. And states are doing what the federal government is refusing to do because we have a polarized and dysfunctional Congress. And we are now looking to the states to pass what is extremely progressive voting rights legislation that restores what Mark pointed out, which is the pre-clearance provision that the Shelby County decision ended in 2013. The Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. And we are just not going to sit idly by and demand something of Congress and think that their inaction is the end of the story. We are going to the state level, and we are going to push these progressive voting rights bills in states across the country while we continue to demand federal voting rights legislation, because this piecemeal approach, while an alternative to congressional inaction, is certainly not the best method of ensuring and protecting the right to vote. So it's a both and strategy.
Thank you. Other questions, Tess?
Keena Cravison asks, how can we raise awareness around the current threat to our democracy on a grassroots level with our family and friends who are overwhelmed with the realities and stress of day-to-day living?
Who wants to take that, Maya? You want to?
Yeah, so one of the things that we're doing, and again, the Leadership Conference is a coalition. We have 230 groups of members, but we also have partners, including partners on the ground in states across the country, as does everyone here, and it's why we work together so effectively. We're actually working on some of the messaging for that, just to both Janae and Damon's points about the importance of state-level work and focusing on states. It's also focusing specifically on the communities who are often left out, and I know Melanie Campbell's been working on this hugely in important places, usually where people show up right before an election rather than doing all the hard work in building to an election. So part of what we're doing, and you can start to see some of that at And Still I Vote, which is part of a Leadership Conference campaign around voting, but we are increasingly working on those kinds of tools and in collaboration. And that's a great place to start to see them.
Derek, I know you have a big campaign this fall. Perhaps you could address the question as well.
Sure. At NAACP, we launched a peer-to-peer campaign. We're recruiting 300,000 volunteers over 22 states to get neighbors to talk to neighbor. You can go to nacp.org. You can sign up. We will give you information, put you on the platform. You can text message your neighbor. You can send an email, or you can call. We've tested this project since 2018. What we have found that when neighbors talk to neighbors, not celebrities, but people talking to people in the same community, that's how you move the needle. Elections are won in inches, not miles. And so every vote actually counts in each one of the districts that we are looking at, as well as statewide elections across the country. So NAACP.org, please sign up. If you want to work on the polls, that's NAACPLDF.org. If you want to, Maya has a project, Damon has a project. Social justice isn't a competition. We just got to get people engaged and involved and out to vote.
And Derek,
Thelma, go ahead, Thelma.
I have to say that the National Council of Negro Women across the country are joining in on this project, and we have the foot soldiers out there. I mean, those who are out there in the rural areas and the little towns all across. And you know, the women are the ones who get out and work and vote and mobilize and organize and do all those things. And so the National Council of Negro Women members were right out there to mobilize and fight for the vote, and to join all of you in terms of carrying out all of those policies and actions.
And I might add that the National Urban League, interestingly, this weekend, we hosted a training for several hundred organizers who will work in 6 states, 18 communities as a part of our Reclaim Your Vote campaign. Suffice it to say, and Melanie and Rev, you may want to simply add what you are doing as well, that all of us have efforts. We coordinate these efforts, and we welcome the involvement, the energy, the volunteerism, or the self-propelled campaigns of others. This is a big task. There are 45 million Black Americans in this country. There are 350 million Americans in this country. We have to touch, as Derek said, our friends, our neighbors, our family members multiple times so that the scourge of this attack on democracy is well understood, and we channel our outrage and our anger right into the polling place on election day. So Melanie and Rev, you want to update on the campaigns you all have?
Thanks, Mark. Again, we at the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation with our Black Women's Roundtable and Black You Vote launched the Unity 22 Black Voting and Power Building campaign, which is made up of about 60 national state-based organizations. We are focused, as all of us, on a nonpartisan effort to really maximize our collective power, but we also are focusing in very, very deeply, focus on Black women and young people as our focus. You can go to unitycampaign.org. What we do say to everybody listening right now, make sure that you are what we call "Are You Ready to Vote?", which is our really messaging campaign to make sure that we are prepared by making sure that you get everyone in your family to check your voter registration status today. If you want to do anything on the 59th anniversary of the March on Washington, check that voter registration status today. You will be able to, because we know there's so many states that have passed these voter suppression laws that we are yet to see the full impact. And we don't want you to show up on November 8th or go to early vote and find out you've been purged because we don't have the protection of the Voting Rights Act in its full strength because of the Supreme Court. So check that status. You can do that at our website or any of my colleagues' website to make sure that you are ready to vote. Check that voter registration status. So in case you have to re-register, you have time to do that now. So unitycampaign.org is where to go.
Reverend?
Well, as I said at the beginning, National Action Network is going to focus on the ground in 5 states. We are all across the country with our chapters mobilizing, but we're going to in 5 states: Florida, Ohio, Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, do series of town hall meetings that'll be live on my television show, which I'm gonna have to get off to go into production for. And we will be bringing my radio show there. We are also using our church network around the country to really drive home people checking their voter registration and checking what have changed in terms of their state laws to bring people out to vote. These are church groups that had, where in the past had worked with Souls to the Polls, have new challenges where it is still there. Souls to the Polls, like a Reverend Holmes in Florida, or those that led other states. I won't get into names. We will continue to strengthen that, but I'll personally be focusing on 5 states that will be televised, as well as door to door, led by our faith leaders and our grassroots leaders. Reverend Ron Saylor in our Atlanta office of National Action Network is coordinating. You can get all of the breakdown on a daily basis at www.nationalactionnetwork.net, www.nationalactionnetwork.net. And Mark, can I be excused? I've got to get ready for.
Yeah, thank you, Reverend. Thank you for joining
show.
us. And we are about to wrap up, Tessa. Are there any other questions on the board? We'll take one more if there's another question.
Barrington Salmon also asked if there is a infrastructure that's already in place for the things that you talked about.
There is an infrastructure in place for the work that we're all going to do this fall, because historically we've done this work in the past. We all had campaigns in 2020, 2018, 2016, and historically. So there is an infrastructure, but nonetheless, we have to build that infrastructure, strengthen that infrastructure, expand that infrastructure, recruit more people, make best use of technology. We are up against a concerted, pernicious, sinister effort to intimidate and thwart and undermine the right to vote. Now it includes elected secretaries of states and elections officials, people acting under color of law who are threatening to, in effect, violate the law. So we need expanded, strengthened. This fight is unlike any fight we have seen. The threats of the use of violence. We have to protect our communities, protect ourselves. We will not be intimidated. Let me say that again. We will not be intimidated or threatened by what these forces suggest. We're going to be strong and resolute, and we're going to continue to fight until hell freezes over, and then we'll fight on the ice. And with that, let me thank all of you all for joining us today. We want to thank the media for their time, attention, and good questions. Our staff who assisted us with preparations for today, and certainly all my colleagues. Our work goes on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Take care.